Hello, and welcome to Obscure History. Today's topic will be continuing our ongoing discussions on the Seleucid Empire, following the latter years of Antiochus III's reign. Like Icarus, the great Hellenistic monarch had flown to equally great heights, but was soon seared by the sun in the form of Rome and her allies. He had been the linchpin that the rest of the empire was formed around, but the defeat at Magnesia and his subsequent death threatened to undo all the prior gains he had made. The mantle of leadership thus fell to his second son, Seleucus IV. Let us find out together if the son of Antiochus the Great and Laodice III can manage to tread the line. First of all, it is worth noting that not much can be obtained from our primary or secondary sources regarding Seleucus IV in general, but this is especially true for his early life. As the second-born male in the royal family, Seleucus was always destined to be a spare part in the empire's political apparatus. As previously covered, Antiochus III Megas had been in the exact same position in his early life, but due to his future significance in the wider ancient world, I believe that his earlier life was better preserved than his eventual successor. That's not to say that in his own day, Seleucus was insignificant by any means, but it could help to explain the imbalance we find in our sources. Born in the year 218 BC, our first attested mention of Seleucus is when he was made the governor of Thrace following its recapture by his father between 196 and 194 BC, with its regional capital at the newly rebuilt Lysimachia. This means that he had accompanied Antiochus on his march westward following the military campaigns against Ptolemaic Egypt. Before then, we know that the rest of the royal family were residing in Antioch in Syria, so it's probably not too far of a stretch to say that he was probably born and raised there. Like his older brother's fight with the Ptolemies, the king took the younger Seleucus with him to subdue the local Thracian tribes, giving the young prince a first-hand lesson in warfare. When Antiochus crossed back over into Anatolia, Seleucus was tasked with seeing the completion of the rebuilding efforts in Lysimachia and keeping the Thracians in check, whilst continuing to stockpile supplies for the possible conflict with Rome. As Thrace was an important buffer region between the rest of Europe and the important Seleucid holdings in Asia Minor, Seleucus must have shown a natural aptitude for governance from a relatively early age. The appointment certainly would have allowed him to see the inner workings of empire on a provincial level. This valuable insight taught him lessons that he would no doubt use later in life. This position also carried a great deal of trust on the part of Antiochus, as the possibility of war with Rome and her allies was looming like a spectre over the empire, making Seleucus the first point of contact should conflict actually materialize. Originally built by Lysimachus, one of the bodyguards to Alexander the Great in 309 BC, the settlement bearing his name was strategically placed at the entrance to the Thracian Chersonese, thus tightly controlling a key crossing point. We have no reason to doubt that Seleucus was able to carry out the important assignment given to him. By 193 BC, Seleucus received the news containing his older brother's sudden departure from the mortal world. Carried alongside this was the formal elevation of Seleucus to the status of crown prince to the Seleucid domain. A year later in 192 BC, the Seleucid Basileus launched his ill-fated invasion of Greece. His strategy may well have involved father and son combining forces, but the Romans and their allies were well prepared for such an outcome. The Macedonians had blocked the passes leading into Macedon and the rest of Greece beyond, preventing Seleucus from rendering practical assistance to Antiochus. Following the disaster at Thermopylae in 191 BC, the king was forced to retreat back across the Aegean Sea. Soon afterwards, he ordered Seleucus and his forces to abandon his position in Thrace in order to punish Pergamon for siding with the Romans. The following events are best recounted by Appian in his works, The Syrian Wars. Quote, "About this time, Seleucus, the son of Antiochus, ravaged the territory of Eumenes and laid siege to Pergamon, shutting up the soldiers in it. On account of this, Eumenes sailed with haste to Elea, the naval station of his kingdom, and with him Lucius Aemilius Regulus, the successor of Livius as admiral. 1,000 foot soldiers and 100 picked horse had been sent by the Achaeans as allies to Eumenes. When their commander, Diophanes, from the wall saw the soldiers of Seleucus sporting and drinking in a contemptuous way, he urged the Pergamenes to join him in a sally against the enemy. As they would not agree to this, he armed his 1,000 foot and his 100 horse, led them out of the city under the wall, and stood there quietly. The enemy derided him for a long time on account of the smallness of his force, and because he did not dare to fight, but he fell upon them while they were taking their dinner, threw them into confusion, and put their advance guard to flight. While some sprang for their arms, and others tried to bridle their horses, or to catch those that had run away, or to mount those that would not stand, Diophanes won a most glorious victory. The Pergamenes cheered vociferously from the walls, but even then not venturing out. Having killed as many as he could in a brief demonstration, and taken a certain number of prisoners with their horses, he quickly returned. The following day, he again stationed the Achaeans under the wall, the Pergamenes again not going out with him. Seleucus approached him with a large body of horse and challenged him to battle, but Diophanes did not accept the challenge. He kept his station close under the wall and watched his opportunity. Seleucus remained till midday, then he turned and led his tired horsemen back. Then Diophanes fell upon his rear and threw it into confusion, and after doing all the damage he could, returned forthwith to his place under the wall. By continually stealing upon the enemy in this way whenever they were collecting forage or wood, and inflicting losses upon them, he compelled Seleucus to move away from Pergamon, and finally drove him out of Eumenes' territory altogether. Despite the bloodied nose, the Crown Prince had initially seen some success by capturing the Ionian city of Phoenicia after it had sided with the Roman-led coalition, but even this gain was soon reversed following the Seleucids' decisive naval loss at the Battle of Meonesus. No longer being supported by sea, many of the coastal settlements of Ionia, including Phoenicia, fell out of Seleucid control. Father and son were reunited once more in the lead-up to the Battle of Magnesia by 190 to 189 BC. After covering the events of this battle in the last episode, I will refrain from going into too much detail again, but for our purposes, we know that the Crown Prince was given overall command of the Seleucid left flank, along with the general Zeuxis, who was stationed out in front with his skirmisher vanguard. Unfortunately, we have no mention from the likes of Appian and Polybius regarding Seleucus's personal involvement in the clash, but based on what he previously covered, it is not hard to imagine that he found it a great challenge to organize the various troop types under his command. For a quick recap, the Seleucid scythe chariots got spooked after they had been barraged with missiles from the opposing Roman and Pergamene force, which then proceeded to collide with their own friendly units behind them. The king of Pergamon, Eumenes, used the disorder to his advantage and struck terror into the whole Seleucid left flank, which promptly fled the field of battle. Seleucus is not mentioned again in our sources until after the fighting reached its catastrophic conclusion. Managing to escape with by far the largest portion of the army that was spared, Seleucus rushed to his father's side at Apamea a few days after the engagement, by which time the outcome was clear. Leaving officials to hammer out the peace terms with Roman allies, the king and prince returned to Syria. By July of 187 BC, Antiochus the Great had been struck down during his raid of a temple dedicated to the god Baal in the region of Elymais. This marked the official ascension of Seleucus, now fourth of his name, as Basileus to the Seleucid Empire. The burden of rulership was now his to bear, which included adhering to the humiliating Treaty of Apamea. To briefly recap, the treaty stipulated great limitations on the Seleucids' military arsenal, including the banning of mercenary recruitment west of the Taurus Mountains, the limiting of their naval capabilities to just 12 warships, and all their elephants were either handed over to Rome or were to be killed outright. To make matters more interesting, there was still a vast quantity of the total war indemnity of 15,000 silver talents left to be paid directly to the Roman Republic. Antiochus III was able to pay off the initial 500 talents once the agreement was made in 188 BC, with a further 2,500 also being paid later in the same year, once the Senate officially ratified the treaty. He died whilst trying to pay off another 1,000 in 187 BC, so this left Seleucus with 12,000 talents in total left outstanding. Like many other contemporary states, the Seleucids utilized the Athenian Attic standard of measurement for their precious metal coins. This was because throughout its long history, Athenian coinage was seen as the most reliable and successful standard of measurement. It was by no means the only one, as different regions tended to use other weight measurements, but it was arguably the most prolific system used. So to give us some perspective on how massive a sum the Romans were demanding, let's do some quick math. Whilst the weight measurements had declined slightly since the days of Alexander, a single Attic talent of silver was the equivalent of roughly 6,000 silver drachma, which was around 26 kilos in weight. One silver drachma was in turn the equivalent of 1 day's work for a skilled labourer or 1 day's recruitment of a mercenary soldier. This means that the total amount of the war indemnity owed by the Seleucids was about 90 million drachma, or about 387,000 kilograms of silver, assuming each one weighed the standard 4.3 grams. Giving an exact amount in modern terms is always going to be tricky, especially when working with a currency so ancient, but using a converter which I found, which I will link in the video's description, I was given a grand total of $3,915 million US, which is a staggering amount. Even if it's not exact, it can make us appreciate to a large degree just how much Rome was able to financially stymie the Seleucids. If anyone can give a more accurate figure, then I welcome them to post in the comments. Adding further stress to the financial burden was the loss of highly monetized regions such as Asia Minor to Pergamon and Rhodes, where the plentiful Greek cities there would have aided greatly in paying off the debt. The ultimate result of these policies being forced on them was one of a weakening of the empire's standing. particularly in the eyes of its neighbours. They were like hungry sharks surrounding a great leviathan that seemed to be slowly bleeding out. If the Seleucids were to tread the very precarious line of placating the Romans whilst also keeping in check the peoples that were subject to them, then Seleucus IV had to make each decision with considerable care. With this in mind, and as we shall see, it is no wonder that he would adopt a mostly political stance when it came to resolving the issues of his day throughout his tenure of rule, rather than busting out the old-school warrior king that his father and forefathers could better afford to do. The first few years of any new head of state were always going to be critical to their longer-term success. Given the situation he found himself in, Seleucus IV must have had this at the forefront of his thinking. To begin with, he adopted the epithet Philopator, the father-loving. This was to give a not-so-subtle reminder to the people he ruled over of his relation to the once great king. Next on his agenda was to garner support from those who had served his father. One great example of this can be seen in a letter sent by the king himself directly to Theophilus, who was the epistates or overseer of Seleucia at Piraea, as well as the city's other leading magistrates in 186 BC. Within it, Seleucus wishes it to be known that a certain Aristocholus, who had taken residence there, was to receive great praise for his contributions towards the city and for the services rendered by him during the wars of Antiochus III. Quote, King Seleucus to Theophilus and the magistrates and the city of Seleucia in Piraea, greetings. As Aristocholus, one of the honoured friends, has rendered services with all goodwill to our father, and our brother and ourself, and has at the most critical times given assiduous demonstrations of his good attitude towards our state, we do in other matters take thought for him worthily of the goodwill that he displays, and we have now honoured him with a bronze statue, which we wish to have erected in your city. The statue was to be placed in Theophilus' own office, glittering for all to witness. In addition to these honours, Aristocholus was also to be granted citizenship and enrolled into the deme or district of Olympias and the tribe Laodicus, which made up part of Seleucia at Piraea. Normally, citizenship would only be granted by a vote of the citizens' assembly. In bypassing the assembly, Seleucus had made sure that Aristocholus received his rewards, and in turn, the loyalty and support of an important individual. By promoting Aristocholus as a friend of the king, Philoi tu Vasileos, Seleucus had ensured that this individual would serve his personal interests within Seleucia at Piraea. When reading the book Courts and Elites in the Hellenistic Empires by Rolf Strootman, these actions taken by Seleucus to win the favour of such critically acclaimed individuals is put into further context. Strootman tells us that the individuals who were associated with the king were important to show off to everyone else. In this way, the praise and status heaped onto those people by the monarch was in itself fed back into the Basileus as it improved their own standing. As mentioned in our sources, when Antiochus III returned from his war with Rome, he was heavily criticized by his friends, or philoi, the term most often used to describe the king's royal retinue, but it was also used to describe those friends of the king who were not in active participation within the royal court. I'd imagine that Seleucus must have seen this breakdown between his father and his royal philoi, and due to his involvement in the defeat at Magnesia, perhaps even had his own disagreements between his own retinue of philoi behind closed doors. In official correspondence, they were referred simply as the friends of the king, oi philoi tou vassaleos. Those philoi who were continually active at court and more often than not grew up alongside the future monarch as royal paides or pages. Both the royal paides and philoi were two closely linked institutions that all the major Hellenistic monarchies had inherited from the Argead dynasty of Macedon. Fundamentally, the concept of friendship, philia, between the king and his court was considered a very sacred bond. If a philoi was discovered or even suspected to have committed treason against his monarch, then only the harshest of punishments would be dealt out after the convicted individual had been scrutinized enough by the other philoi and the king. My mind immediately flashes back to Achaeus, chained up on the floor facing Antiochus III, with the other assembled friends condemning him to a grisly end. This example also demonstrates the level of power the philoi could wield, as in that instance, Antiochus didn't wish to have his cousin killed, but was overruled by his friends despite being the king. In his research, Strootman examines how the philoi's behaviour was to some extent controlled through ritualized practices, so that the grandeur of the Basileus was on full display for all to see. But a military defeat as large in scale as at Magnesia could and did seem to have caused a crack in the harmony between the two. On top of personally providing counsel to the monarch, philoi were also assigned as military commanders, so it's not far of a stretch to assume that most of Seleucus's closest friends would have participated in the conflict with Rome. It makes sense then for Seleucus, upon receiving the royal diadem, to strengthen the bonds between himself and those closely associated with him, as the philoi were by extension a way to measure the power and prestige of the monarch himself. Another point worth noting here is that we often think of kings and emperors as this all-powerful position, which everyone below them has to follow without question. But this view is based on more modern ideas of the nation-state, which in ancient times, and to our current understanding, simply did not exist as a concept back then. Throughout the classical Greek period, the polei, or city-state, dominated the geopolitical landscape of its time. The same was the case during the Hellenistic era that followed. Although each individual polei was broken down into tribes, it did provide the nucleus to bond people closer together to an extent, allowing for some degree of shared identity. A great example is the use of religion, devoting special attention to the worship of certain gods and goddesses. As we've already explored to a degree, through the example of Seleucus IV and the assembly of Seleucia at Piraea, the concept of citizenship was also firmly entrenched with the polei. With the exception of Imperial Rome, applying the idea of citizenship to cover a broader geopolitical area was not entertained by the powers that be. We often fall into the trap, myself included, of talking about powers such as the Seleucids as an individual entity, whereby everyone who falls under the olive branch of the empire would identify themselves as a Seleucid, when at most this only really should be applied to the monarch and his court. Instead, all the Hellenistic states were reliant on personal connections to the monarch, which can be seen as an alternative to the idea of a nation-state. By employing this means, an energetic monarch could use his connections to steer the prow on the straight and narrow. This was especially important for the Seleucid house, given that it had inherited such a large expanse of territory from Alexander and Seleucus I, filled with a plethora of different ethnic groups. At its most basic exchange, the relationship between the Basileus, his vassal monarchs, and the everyday people through the Pole was a symbolic one based on mutual cooperation and understanding. Unless they formed a league, such was the case on mainland Greece with the Aetolian and Achaean leagues, to name a few, individual cities could not hope to field and sustain large armies by themselves in times of conflict. By becoming a part of a wider network with the monarch at the top, it gave them a greater assurance regarding security and economical stability. This in turn had the effect of feeding the idea of needing a strong militaristic leader and protector, which the Seleucid family was all too happy to step into. One thing that helped the House of Seleucus in facilitating acceptance of this policy, particularly between the various ethnic groups of the East, was the fact that they had been used to being part of something bigger through the various other empires that once existed in that part of the world. Both the Greek and non-Greek settlements of the empire were afforded a great level of autonomy from the beginning through to the reign of Seleucus IV. As we've already seen, Seleucia ad Piraea had an assembly of leading figures to run the everyday functions of that city, providing that the city citizens and the magistrates paid tribute and fealty to the ruling family, examples being in the form of providing soldiers and coins bearing royal portraiture and iconography, then no cause for alarm was needed. With all that said, we will return to our main narrative, but having this knowledge allows us to better understand the inner workings of the Seleucid realm and the situation Seleucus IV was in. And I would thoroughly recommend Rolf Strootman's book, Courts and Elites in the Hellenistic Empires, for those listeners who are interested in going into more depth about the inner workings of the Hellenistic court. It is a great read which sheds some light onto a subject that is only just recently getting much needed attention. In 185 BC, the Basileus and his sister wife, Laodice IV, gave birth to their firstborn son, whom they named Demetrius, thus securing the throne for the main royal line. The boy was spared being named either of the usual dynastic names, to the relief of modern people studying the time period. Although not an obvious choice, the name did have links to Stratonike I, the wife of Seleucus I and Antiochus I, as she was the daughter of Demetrius I of the Antigonid house, which despite their defeat by the Romans, still ruled in Macedon at this time. Wanting to link the ties between the two houses further, Seleucus would offer his daughter's hand in marriage to the new Antigonid king, Perseus. The daughter, named Laodice V, must have been born sometime before 185 BC in order for this union to take place, and would make her the eldest child of Seleucus IV. According to Polybius, Laodice was transported by a Rhodian vessel to Macedon, where the couple wedded in 178 BC. To give you a brief summary of the situation in Macedon following the end of the Roman-Seleucid War goes as follows. Philip V had been on the winning side of the conflict. He was able to keep those territories that he captured as a reward for his assistance to the Republic. By focusing on consolidating his power, Macedon was able to experience a miniature boom in its agricultural and mining outputs, which generated exceeding revenues for the kingdom. Fearing this revival in fortunes, their neighbours continually complained to Rome that no good could come from a revitalized Macedon. It seemed that their suspicions were being materialized when Philip began expanding his power base into the Balkans once more. To counterbalance the sudden revival of Macedonian fortunes, the Romans released Philip's younger son, also named Demetrius, from his captivity in Rome back to his homeland. This must have seemed a blessing to Philip at first, but very quickly it proved to be a point of fracture within the usually close-knitted Antigonid royal family. The younger Demetrius, who had spent a considerable amount of his youth as a Roman hostage, had returned an avid Romanophile. Philip now had a problem, or should I say, problems. One son who loved the Romans, and the other son who absolutely despised them for all the harm they had wrought. Two camps began to form around each prince, one that was anti-Roman, and the other that had a favourable disposition towards them. You can probably see where this is heading. Seen as a dangerous threat, the older Perseus tried and at first failed to oust his younger half-brother by falsely accusing him of making an attempt on his life. He no less managed to finally destroy him when a series of correspondence, allegedly from the old Roman general Flamininus, the same Flamininus who had been the victor of Cynoscephalae against Philip nearly 20 years earlier, plotted to back Demetrius's claim to the royal purple. With the evidence being further corroborated by a leading general of Philip, the king had no choice but to assign him to house arrest, but soon had him secretly executed. Now a sad older man with a guilty heart, the 59-year-old Philip V passed away only a year after the incident in 179 BC, leaving Perseus and the anti-Roman faction firmly in charge of Macedon. It is with this context in mind that Perseus readily accepted Seleucus's offer of marriage once it was made. Not only did it hold the potential to revive the alliance between the two Hellenic powers, but it also flaunted a very obvious statement that could be pressed right into the Romans' faces that would have made them very uncomfortable. Complain all you want, I am making an alliance with an old enemy of yours. Whilst this could have been easily seen as a reckless decision on the part of Seleucus, it actually was a fair move to make. The Treaty of Apamea never explicitly instructed that alliances with former friends were forbidden. This display of soft power was Seleucus's way of applying a degree of pressure to Rome's allies, such as Pergamon, who now once again found themselves caught in the middle of another potential wildfire. It also ensured that the Seleucids would continue to have some sense of political relevance west of the Taurus Mountains. Seleucus was also willing to extend his alliances outside of Macedon to another old friend to the state. Polybius mentions that he had sent envoys to the Achaean League in hopes that friendship could be renewed, which was readily accepted. Part of the negotiations included providing the Achaeans with 10 longships, but these were politely refused. Back in Anatolia, a new player was starting to take center stage by causing further chaos in the region during Seleucus's reign. King Pharnaces I of Pontus was hungrily eyeing up his neighbours in an attempt to broaden his realm's power and political prestige. Rewinding the clock to 181 BC, he had gotten on bad terms with Rome's allies in the region. Pharnaces had sent a delegation to the Senate in tandem with the Rhodians and Eumenes to debate the issue, but rather than wait for their response, he suddenly struck into neighbouring Cappadocia and had prepared an expeditionary force numbering 10,000 to march into Galatia. It is at this point that Pharnaces extended an open invitation for Seleucus to come with an army and join his forces. The Pontic ruler would have thought it a natural request to make, as the confusingly intricate marriage alliances ensured that the blood ties between the Mithridatic and Seleucid dynasties were tightly interwoven. In this particular instance, Pharnaces had not only married Nysa, the niece of Seleucus IV, but he was also already related to her due to both her parents being first cousins of Pharnaces. Seleucus is the brother of the two parents, and so he was another first cousin. If all this wasn't weird enough, Seleucus's mother, Laodice III, was herself a Mithridatic princess and is related to Pharnaces as his aunt. The two dynasties had long since been linked by a series of pre-existing unions since the time of Antiochus II, who married his daughter off to Mithridates II, all leading to this rather uncomfortably close-to-home situation. Most people who look at the Ptolemaic family tree by itself will develop a headache, but I say that the real challenge would be to understand how all the major Hellenistic dynasties are so intricately and sickeningly connected when put into our modern frame of mind. Naturally, this led me to think more on the dynamics of Hellenistic monarchies. One interesting way to look at the period with its many fascinating characters is that the whole picture is made of what is essentially a series of grand family disputes. We must always remember that whether we are talking about a certain individual, this kingdom or that kingdom, their enemies would more often than not be related to them by blood in some manner. The best way I could think about it was like a family meal on a special occasion. Picture this. You're sat down with your immediate family, as well as those members who are more distantly related. It is not uncommon for there to be some level of infighting between siblings and cousins. Now imagine Seleucus IV sat at the dinner table. Across from him sat his cousin, Pharnaces. Between them sits a singular turkey leg. Pharnaces, eager to get his hands on the last remaining meat on the table, rushes to grab it. Seleucus likewise wishes to do exactly the same, only niggling in the back of his mind was the threat of another war with Rome should he be tempted into taking the bait. The metaphorical turkey leg up for grabs is an entire kingdom filled with the fates of many tens, if not hundreds of thousands of souls. In many ways, the dynamics of a simple, possibly awkward family meal can be translated and bloated up to become a violent struggle between ancient states. Leaving Pharnaces to snaffle the turkey leg, we return to our main narrative as the Pontic king soon came to regret his hungry appetite, as he was forced to back down from his war-hawking by 179 BC after being hard-pressed by a coalition between Pergamon and Ariarathes IV of Cappadocia. He relinquished any territorial gains and claims with the exception of the city of Sinope along the Black Sea coast. On this occasion, Seleucus's sudden change of heart may well have prevented a much wider conflict, sparing his realm from the horrors of war for now. But the decisions to renew the Macedonian alliance and even entertain the idea of an invasion of Asia Minor would cost Seleucus on a personal level. Despite technically not breaching any of the terms of the Treaty of Apamea, King Eumenes II of Pergamon did not see it in the same light. He dispatched envoys to the Senate complaining that Seleucus was rebuilding his power base in the region, and when the news had reached him that a new Seleucid army had assembled to cross over the Taurus mountains, it seemed his suspicions had come true. The Senate, not liking the fact that their ally felt threatened, agreed with Eumenes' assessment of the situation. To keep Seleucus on his best behaviour, they demanded that the Crown Prince Demetrius be handed to them as part of the next round of hostage exchanges, by 178 BC. It was also agreed that the Basileus' own younger brother, Mithridates, who had been in Rome since 189 BC, would be released, as Demetrius would be a far more valuable captive. Seleucus knew better than to protest the request, and so begrudgingly sent his son and heir to be held in Rome. In terms of the other members of the royal family, the king was now left with his youngest son, Antiochus, who had only been born in 180 BC. Seleucus's mother and wife of Antiochus III, Laodice III, seems to have remained politically active during parts of his son's reign, although to what degree exactly is largely unknown. We know from a handful of Greek inscriptions originating from the city of Susa that she was referred to as the Queen Mother. The same inscriptions, dated to around 177 BC, tell us that Seleucus conferred honours to her by associating her with Nicephorus Aphrodite, Victorious Aphrodite. With no further mentions of her in the primary sources, we are left with the dates 177 to 176 BC as the possible years of her death, with these honours possibly being linked to just that. Looking towards the eastern frontiers of the empire, there were significant changes on the map. Whilst not much is known about the situation in the region of Parthia during this time, its now independent ruler, Phraates, along with his leading nobles, were glad to be rid of the Seleucid yoke. Whilst no further expansion of Parthia is recorded under Seleucus's watch, we can see clear evidence of their independent spirit from coins minted under Phraates, where he began styling himself using the Greek title Basileus. In some surviving examples, Phraates even had the audacity to also claim the title Basileus Megas, Great King. This marks a significant shift in how the Parthians viewed themselves, or more precisely, how they wished to be viewed, as this is the first clear indication of Greek influence being directly linked to them. As the years of paying off the war indemnity passed, and attention was called more and more to the west, it must have grown increasingly difficult for the empire to properly enforce its authority through military might, meaning the Seleucids could do little but watch their Parthian neighbours with growing anxiety, especially as they now had a foothold in the Iranian plateau. But there is another probable factor as to why the Parthians did not take full advantage of the situation. For at the same time, the Greco-Bactrian kingdom would reach its zenith territorially by 185 BC under Demetrius Anikitos, the Unconquered. This was the very same Demetrius that had met with Antiochus III at the negotiating table, which concluded the end of hostilities between the two powers. This sudden expansion into the Indian subcontinent was facilitated with the collapse of the Mauryan Empire at around the same time. The death of Antiochus III had reset the relationship between the Seleucids and Greco-Bactrians, who, like the other powers surrounding it, sensed its opportunity to chip away at some of the empire's most outlying regions, such as Aria and Arachosia. I have actually made a separate video covering the expansion of the Greco-Bactrians in more depth, which I will link in this video's description if you are interested. Unfortunately for our favourite Hellenistic realm, I would be remiss to say this is as bad as it gets in the east, but more on this to come as the situation unfurls. But for now, we need to shift our attention westward once again. Following the Seleucid defeat at the hands of Rome, another pair of individuals had succeeded in throwing off Seleucid overlordship. Artaxes and Zariadres, who had been appointed as strategoi of Greater Armenia and the region of Sophene respectively by Antiochus III, had decided that now was their time to rule in their own right by 188 BC. Both men were descended from the Orontid dynasty that had been in charge of Armenia since 330 BC as client kings. The rebellious Strategoi sensed weakness, and they were correct to wager that no military response was forthcoming from Seleucus IV. Likewise, the rulers of Cappadocia and Media Atropatani would continue with business as usual without the Seleucids as their overlord. Meanwhile, the situation between the Seleucids and their age-old rivals the Ptolemies was quiet for the most part. Ptolemy V Epiphanes and his court had been relentless in their attempts to restore law and order throughout Upper Egypt following the end of the Great Revolt in 185 BC. The rebellion, with its figurehead Anquenefer, the successor to Hornwenefer, had been soundly crushed in a decisive battle somewhere in the deserts of the Delta region. The Greco-Macedonian overlords had proven their mettle against the natives, who now feared great reprisals for their act of defiant independence. But as it turned out, many of the surviving rebels had been given amnesty for their past transgressions and were allowed to return to their homes on the condition that they continue to work the land. Anquenefer himself had been imprisoned and possibly even spared on the insistence of the Egyptian priesthood. On a side note, we see a shift in the role played by the native Egyptian priesthood at this time, one that would continue throughout the kingdom's existence. This is most likely connected to the tumultuous years under Ptolemy V, and is thus a direct response to the chaos. It seemed a mutual enough understanding. By empowering this group, Ptolemy had lent further legitimacy in the eyes of the native Egyptians, whilst the same was true the other way round, finally giving more of a voice within the upper echelons of their Greco-Macedonian masters. Because of the Great Revolt, many farms had been either unworked at best, or had simply ceased to exist completely. This was a devastating blow to the country, as Egypt's economy relied heavily on the wealth produced by its bountiful harvests, with the surplus generated being exported to the outside world. To put it broadly, the state Egypt was left in after the ordeal was far from ideal. Ptolemy and his inner circle had hoped that by implementing policies of clemency, they could help to rebuild what was lost much quicker. And to their credit, it had largely been a success. This, combined with the settling of further garrisons in the Upper Nile, commanded by a new military governor known as the Epistrategos, the soil-rich lands of the Nile began steadily producing a large quantity of produce once more. Most of Egypt, by now tired of civil strife, looked forward to a long period of rest and stability. However, Ptolemy had not forgotten the humiliating smackdown he had received from Antiochus III during the Fifth Syrian War in the early 200s BC, and had been eager to course-correct even before the end of the Great Revolt. When the Roman-Seleucid conflict erupted in 192 BC, Ptolemy was eager to provide monetary and even go as far as to provide military aid to Rome, which was refused, probably on the account of them being rather annoyed at Ptolemy for accepting a separate peace with the Seleucids. In 191 BC, he again tried a different tactic by sending another embassy to the Senate, attempting to sweet-talk them. The envoys heaped praise upon the Romans for the victory against Antiochus at Thermopylae, but in typical Roman fashion, this too was bluntly waved aside. They then found a way to add further salt to the wound in 188 BC by giving the former lands in southern Anatolia to Rhodes and Pergamon following the Seleucid defeat, rather than giving back what should have been Ptolemaic overseas possessions. When his father-in-law suddenly perished in the temple robbery in Elymais, Ptolemy resolved to restore Collier Syria and Phoenicia to his control. In 185 BC, the Macedonian pharaoh sent an old philoi of his, Aristonicus, to mainland Greece in order to purchase mercenaries for his grand designs. He also further ingratiated himself with the Greeks by renewing an alliance with the Achaean League, which had previously been negotiated by his grandfather Ptolemy III. By 182 BC, Aristonicus was leading naval raids into Syria off the coast of Tripoli. Ptolemy's preparations for a full-scale invasion of the empire were nearly complete. Requiring additional funds to finalize things, the king was holding discussions regarding the subject with an unnamed philoi. Diadorus relates that when his friend asked him how he would go about acquiring the outstanding funds for such a campaign, Ptolemy pointed to his other philoi and told his companion, quote, "There, walking about, are my money bags." The 3rd century Neoplatonic philosopher Porphyrius, writing almost 2 centuries after Diadorus, also confirms Ptolemy's rhetoric almost word for word. The end of Ptolemy V's rule is somewhat debatable, but if Porphyry's account is to be believed, then these famous last words of Ptolemy may well have proven to be Seleucus's saving grace. Quote, "When this saying became publicly known, the generals became afraid that he would strip them of their wealth, and therefore they treacherously killed him." It is probably under these circumstances that young Ptolemy V vanished from history, aged just 29, leaving Egypt largely in the hands of the Queen Cleopatra I, who had been made co-ruler with her 6-year-old son, Ptolemy VI. Seleucus IV would now benefit from his father's prior marriage arrangement now that his sister was in charge of Egypt. While she would prove to be quite dutiful in her position as co-ruler, which, by the way, is the first instance of a Ptolemaic Egyptian queen ruling in her own right, she would not forget where she came from as a Seleucid princess, and still would have had strong ties within her brother's court. One of her first acts as Queen Regent was to immediately cancel the war preparations her husband had undertook. This decision single-handedly diffused the growing tension between the two powers, which very nearly spilled into another Syrian war. It would seem that for now, both the Ptolemies and Seleucids would be able to coexist without tearing into each other for once, all in thanks to one woman. There are no mentions in any of the sources of any grand building projects when it comes to the domestic policies of Seleucus IV, but this is hardly surprising given the financial restraints the king was now faced with. The king was expected to be the grand patron of cities, financing public works and taking the pressure off when natural disasters arose, like in the days of his parents. The contrast between that of his father, who had brought back the riches of Bactria and India following his eastern anabasis, and that of his son, who had to scrape together what little he could to give to the Romans, must have been striking indeed. Given this, I'd imagine his reserved policies when it came to spending on public projects did not endear him to many average people. But by 175 BC, Seleucus was on the verge of finally paying off the war indemnity as per the treaty, with just one final push necessary to be rid of this humiliation. The events which occur next are sourced from the books of Maccabees, as events in Judea will draw the attention of the king and his high officials. Arguments were being raged over administrative affairs in Jerusalem involving the high priest of the Second Temple. The position had been a hereditary one, controlled by the Zadokite dynasty for much of the Second Temple's existence, which could credit its foundations in large part to Cyrus the Great. At this time, the office was held by Annaeus III, who had been high priest for about a decade by this point. This Annaeus was known by his countrymen for his piety and hatred for all wickedness. But a certain man named Simon, who hailed from the tribe of Benjamin and was the captain of the temple, began to dispute over the administration in earnest. Realizing that reasoning would not win out by itself, Simon turned to Apollonius of Tarsus, the Seleucid governor of Collier Syria and Phoenicia. To make sure that his point of view was heard and understood, Simon reported to the governor that an untold sum of wealth was being stored at the temple, paid as sacrifice to the Jewish god. Simon claimed that a great portion of this fortune had nothing to do with the sacrifices, however, and so was essentially up for grabs. If the Seleucid Basileus required such funds, then what was to stop him? Not long after this meeting, Apollonius personally took this news directly to Seleucus, who, as we know, was always looking for a cash boost. It must have been as if Tyche, goddess of fortune herself, was blessing the king with a physical silver and golden opportunity. Seleucus's response to this news can be read in Book 2 of Maccabees. Quote, "The king chose Heliodorus, who was in charge of his affairs, and sent him with commands to effect the removal of the aforesaid money. Heliodorus at once set out on his journey ostensibly to make a tour of inspection of the cities of Collier Syria and Phoenicia, but in fact to carry out the king's purpose. The Philoi and minister to the king arrived at Jerusalem under this false pretense and was at first warmly greeted by Annaeus. As soon as the high priest confirmed the exact amount stored in the temple treasury, that of 400 talents of silver and 200 talents of gold, Heliodorus immediately made his true intentions known. Annoyed at the fact the true amount did not add up to what Simon had claimed, he nonetheless ordered the confiscation of the treasury for the king's own designs. The temple priests prayed to their god for the treasury made in sacrifice to him not to be taken away. Before long, even many of the ordinary folk of Jerusalem also began prostrating themselves in prayer. Book 2 of Maccabees continues on with a fantastical occurrence of what happened next. Quote, "When he arrived at the treasury with his bodyguard, then and there the sovereign of spirits and all authority caused so great a manifestation that all who had been so bold as to accompany him were astounded by the power of God, and became faint with terror. For there appeared to them a magnificently caparisoned horse, with a rider of frightening mane, and it rushed furiously at Heliodorus and struck at him with its front hooves. Its rider was seen to have armour and weapons of gold. 2 young men also appeared to him, remarkably strong, gloriously beautiful, and splendidly dressed, who stood on each side of him and scourged him continuously, inflicting many blows on him. When he suddenly fell to the ground and deep darkness came over him, his men took him up and put him on a stretcher and carried him away. This man, who had just entered the aforesaid treasury with a great retinue and all his bodyguard, but was now unable to help himself, and they recognized clearly the sovereign power of God. Their prayers seemingly answered by divine intervention, the people of Jerusalem joined together in light of the fantastical. Whether it was the divine or just the stiff resistance put up from the temple guards, I'll let you decide. Either way, Heliodorus found himself repelled from the city empty-handed and with bruised body and ego. Following this debacle, the minister marched northwards with his guard to Syria, and if we take Appian's word on what occurs next, which most people do, then he would do more than just deliver bad news to the king. We are told that upon his return, Heliodorus hatched a plan to take over the reins of government. On the 3rd of September 175 BC, Seleucus IV Philopator was murdered in his 12th year of rule, aged 43 at Antioch on the Orontes. The date of death is confirmed via Babylonian scripture, and the Book of Daniel, written around the 160s BC, also seems to confirm Appian's account of a naked power grab, harkening back to when Seleucus III was also stabbed in the back. Heliodorus spared no time in hailing the new 5-year-old Antiochus, the son of his now murdered master, as king. It is assumed that based on her capacity in further events to occur, that Queen Laodice IV escaped the city. In this way, Heliodorus's immediate position was secured, but the empire was left in a more precarious and vulnerable position than it had ever faced before, with the figurehead now just a child pawn in the hands of predatory thugs. The reign of Seleucus IV Philopator is often seen as a time of great unease for the Seleucid Empire. For a long time, the general consensus amongst historians was always one of negativity regarding this particular king. Following off the heels of his energetic predecessor, this Seleucus is often viewed as a weak ruler with little significance within the wider timeline. More recently, however, this view is being further challenged more and more. Despite achieving little to nothing on the battlefield, Seleucus IV was able to achieve relative success in keeping the empire stable enough when only a few wrong moves could have pushed it back over the edge, sending it into another state of fragmentation similar to the beginning of his father's reign. To a large extent, I find Seleucus IV to be a victim of circumstance, for he was unable to fully flex his empire's might given the constraints held over it. Despite this, he proved to have the right temperament for the situation he was left to take care of. I believe that his biggest achievement was nearly paying off the full war indemnity to Rome. One of the main arguments against Seleucus is that he had to drain a considerable amount of silver from the empire's economy in order to achieve this. Whilst the amount was indeed substantial, I would counter the argument that it was detrimental to the empire. The main piece of evidence to counter this argument comes to us through the surviving coins themselves minted under his reign. If the silver supply was running short within the Seleucid domain, then we would expect to see some sort of reduction in both quality and weight in the silver coinage of his day, but this is not the case. If anything, this should be a further testament to Seleucus's abilities as a ruler, as it would have been an easy decision to make to reduce the weight of the coinage in order to facilitate the needs of the day. Just take the example shown here, which I am delighted to say forms a part of my own ancient coin collection. Leaving the standard of coinage intact, however, seemed to invite other issues for Seleucus, as he had to resort to other means of sourcing the wealth needed. I find it highly probable that he had to rely quite heavily on his rich land-owning Philoi to keep bailing him out, but this meant destroying the image of the king being the supreme benefactor. In this, a paradox is created, as technically the king owned all the land under his control, but others were needed to facilitate proper oversight. This meant that Philoi could grow fat from the produce of their estates, as those revenues would only partially be fed back into the royal coffers. Knowing all this, we can speculate quite safely and assume that this financial stress was what ultimately led to Seleucus's demise. I find it hard to believe that Diadorus carried out his despicable plot on his own, so in order to pull off such an operation, he must have aligned himself with other powerful but dissatisfied Philoi, who were simply tired of giving away their wealth that rightfully belonged to them, not Rome. As mentioned before, the common people would have seen little to no benefaction from their king, and this would have extended to the higher echelons of the Seleucid court. It's a fact that empires are built on conquest, with the spoils being often distributed amongst the monarch's followers as rewards for loyalty and good service. As we know, Seleucus had no real wars of conquest to speak of, so there was no real opportunity to present his powerful friends with gifts for their continued loyalty. This all goes to clearly show that a Basileus who was too reliant on his friends for financial aid was no Basileus worth following, let alone dying for. With this tension within the court, it's somewhat amazing that he was able to stay in power for as long as he did. His diplomatic efforts were a partial success, but this did not stop smaller realms such as Armenia and Parthia from slipping away. The last mark against him I would like to mention was the attempted seizure of the wealth of Jerusalem, which left a sourness in the Jewish opinion of the Seleucids. That sourness, fomented at the end of Seleucus IV's reign, will in time turn into fire. But that is a story for another time. If you have made it to the end, then thank you for tuning in. I just wanted to take this opportunity to say an even bigger thank you to the 1,000+ people that are now subscribed to the channel. It proves there is a great interest for history content of a more obscure nature, and it's always thrilling to know that there are people out there who share the same interests as me. Next time, we will be covering the rise of Seleucus IV's younger brother Mithridates, better known as Antiochus IV Epiphanes to the Seleucid purple, a figure that is rather famous or infamous, depending on who you ask. If you have enjoyed what has been covered, why not leave a like and a comment, or subscribe if you want to see more. The sources used for this episode have been included in the video description. So until you hear the drums of war again, this has been Obscure History.